And to the chairman, while I recognize we are engaged in a very, very partisan exercise and a harsh partisan debate, I do want to acknowledge the loss from our congressional family of our representative from Indiana, Ms. Walorski, and I so appreciated your presence at her funeral yesterday. I know it was a difficult time for many of us, and we lost two of our congressional staffers who in many ways are like family. Emma Thompson, who used to work in my office as my communications director. So it has been a tough week, and now we end it with today's rule, providing for the consideration of the Senate amendment to H.R. 5376, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. And I say the so-called Inflation Reduction Act because you would almost need a degree in nanometrology. You'd almost need a micrometer to be able to measure the amount of deficit reduction that is included in this failed legislation that we have in front of us. In fact, this is the second time we've seen this legislative vehicle. The Democrats try to push through partisan budget reconciliation. Now, what does that mean? That means that there is zero input from the Republican side of the aisle. And why is that important? You have a House and a Senate that are almost evenly divided. It's 50-50 in the Senate. They relied on the vice president's vote to get this across the finish line. And as we heard this morning at the swearing-in of our new member, you have a bare majority in the House of Representatives. So don't try to tell people that this has been an exercise that is well thought out, that has come through the committees of jurisdiction, where people have had input. No Republican has had any input into this travesty that we have in front of us today. Mr. Speaker, I sit on the Budget Committee. We did not mark up a budget resolution for fiscal year 2022. Instead, what happened? The budget was deemed passed in a rule vote without zero floor consideration. This bill is a reconfigured Build Back Better Act that the House passed last October that didn't really have the breath to rise up off the floor, but somehow, senators cut a deal, Democratic senators cut a deal with themselves, and now we have it on the floor today. But I stress again, this bill had no Republican input, and it will have a negligible effect on inflation. Now, President Biden, has stated that this bill will reduce inflationary pressures. Oh my God, just make stuff up. What do you mean inflationary pressures? That's not the same thing as actually reducing inflation. In fact, when you look at this bill, when you look at the language of this bill, and recognize that there are things started, but they're only for a short period of time, but in reality, we know that once something started, it never stops up here. So if you remove the sunset provisions from the bill and assume that all spending in this bill is going to be extended through the 10-year budget window, this bill actually spends $745 billion and adds $148 billion to the national debt. After Democrats pushed through a $1.9 trillion reconciliation package, and we all remember when that happened, February, March of 2021, billions of dollars more in spending is the last thing that American consumers need in the middle of record high inflation. To combat inflation, the Federal Reserve has had to raise interest rates. They were late in starting. They dismissed inflation. They said it was transitory, wasn't really happening, figment of your imagination. But then, since March, they've raised interest rates by 2.25%, the fastest cumulative rate hike in over 10 years. Now, according to the Congressional Budget Office, and we really haven't heard from them much this Congress, but according to the Congressional Budget Office, the increase in interest rates will cost taxpayers an extra $100 billion this year alone. So let me describe for you what is costing Americans so much. There are severe negative impacts in implementing government drug price controls, which are included in this bill. However, what most people do not understand is the effect this reconciliation package will have on health care and doctors' practices in America. At the end of this year, Docs are expecting a payment update in Medicare that is now calculated to be 0%. Anywhere else in this town, a 0% update is viewed as a pay cut because we have 8 to 9% inflation. And guess what? That same inflation affecting household budgets affects your budget running a medical practice. But in addition to that, there's a 4.5% Medicare conversion factor, which is reduced, and the adoption of several changes to the evaluation and management current procedural technology codes. The net effect is a big cut to the nation's doctors. That's really where we should have been focusing some of our efforts. But instead, we tell our doctors and our nurses, you're our heroes. You got us through the coronavirus pandemic, the worst pandemic in 100 years. So thank you, heroes. Here's your pay cut. And the doctors go, wait, what? Under this legislation, we'll see changes to Part B drug reimbursements that would lead to an average of a 40% cut for healthcare providers. Wednesday, during the Rules Committee hearing, I offered an amendment with Dr. Murphy to actually fix this problem. I thought, well, maybe it's just an oversight. Maybe they didn't really mean to do this. Unfortunately, it was rejected in the Rules Committee by a party line vote. The confluence of these cuts threatens the sustainability of medical practices and will lead to physicians closing their doors. So let me be quite clear about that. A vote for this bill is a vote to close medical practices. To make matters worse, the providers that would be affected work in fields such as oncology, rheumatology, interventional pain management, hematology, internal medicine, and gastroenterology. I never thought I would be up here fighting to save specialty practices, especially oncology, community oncology, which focuses on the treatment of cancer. But as these practices close, and they will close, care will shift to hospitals. And what happens when the care shifts to hospitals from the doctor's office? Oh, it goes up by a factor of about 66%. So instead of saving money, we're actually costing money. Ultimately, the combined financial pressures will result in limited access to treatment for patients, including those in rural areas. Following a major pandemic and a healthcare workforce shortage, we should be encouraging physicians to keep their practices open in order to have a more stable healthcare system that would benefit patients, but instead we do exactly the opposite. If this bill is signed into law, millions of patients could die waiting for those new drugs and cures that will no longer be developed in their lifetime. The last bill signed into law by President Obama at the end of 2016 was the Cures for the 21st Century Act, something that our committee, Energy and Commerce, worked on, this House passed. Everyone was proud of the Cures for the 21st Century Act. We wanted to deliver those cures for the 21st century to patients who had been long suffering. We wanted to get them there faster. We wanted to get them there at lower cost. But now we're doing exactly the opposite. Millions of patients could die waiting for new drugs and new cures. I've heard directly from providers that potentially millions of patients will be affected if docs close their doors. This bill is anti-doctor and anti-patient, and we will, unfortunately, see those consequences after final passage. This reconciliation bill also includes numerous new Green Deal provisions. There is a tax on natural gas production that will be passed on to consumers. Make no mistake about it. It's going to make it harder and more expensive to heat homes, to buy groceries, to farm the land. This bill establishes a Department of Energy loan guarantee at $250 billion to support greenhouse gas reduction projects. You know, I've been here long enough that I remember Solyndra in the Obama administration. This was a failed investment that cost the American taxpayer $500 million. There is also an energy efficiency home appliance rebate program to allow wealthy Americans to update their homes to the tune of $9 billion, and a $1 billion program to electrify garbage trucks and school buses. The bill includes $27 billion in a greenhouse gas reduction fund at the Environmental Protection Agency that will be a slush fund for greenhouse projects. $27 billion to the Environmental Protection Agency with no guardrails, with no oversight, and we just hope that they're going to fix problems. Good luck with that. It also reinstates the Superfund excise tax on crude oil and imported petroleum, and this will result in an additional $11 billion tax burden on our oil and gas industry in the midst of record high gas prices. You know, it's a telling mental image that the president was forced to go hat in hand over to the Middle East, over to Saudi Arabia, and ask them to pump more oil. It's not like we ran out here, but the president went over to Saudi Arabia, hat in hand, and how embarrassing. They told him they actually weren't able to produce any more than they were right now. And last but not least, this bill contains a $7,500 tax credit for electric vehicles that must be made with a certain percentage of minerals mined in the United States or countries with U.S. free trade agreements. Most of the minerals come from China and Russia. There is not a single electric vehicle currently on the market that complies with this provision, and the European Union recently warned that this may violate World Trade Organization domestic content and local assembly rules. I could continue, but let me highlight some of the tax increases that average Americans will face. This bill creates a 15% minimum book tax on companies, but it includes exclusions for Green New Deal tax credits. A fix to the carried interest loophole was axed in the Senate to buy one vote and replaced with a one-year extension of the state and local salt tax cap. This was done to appease one senator. It was removed and replaced with a pass-through loss limitation, which will prohibit pass-throughs from claiming a certain amount of after loss. Democrats have chosen to protect individuals in high-tax states over Main Street businesses. There's also a 1% excise tax on stock buybacks, which will harm retirement investments. There are extensions of production tax credits for renewables, like we haven't subsidized them enough already, and $80 billion, $80 billion for the Internal Revenue Service, including 87,000 new agents who will all be members of a federal employees union, likely contribute to Democratic campaigns, but are not required to be CPAs. I mean, where in the world do you go to make stuff like this up? Oh yes, the United States House of Representatives run by Democrats. This is a 600% IRS funding increase over last year and a doubling of the number of employees. Man, wouldn't it be great to double the number of employees of the FAA? How many people have recently been stuck trying to get from one place to another with air travel in this country? And instead, we're expanding the IRS. Currently, the best accounting firms are struggling to hire CPAs. How is the IRS going to attract qualified individuals? We'll only create tax technicians who could be injurious to citizens if not properly trained. Americans deserve better. With that, I urge opposition to the rule, and I'll reserve the balance of my time.